All right, so moving right along, one of the next things that we might want to go ahead and do is try to get some more depth in between the different layers here. So one of the things you'll notice here is, first of all, I'm going to make this postmark thing go away for right now. It's sort of distracting to me. So I want to get this flower in the top right corner to kind of stand out some. So one of the things I can do is add a drop shadow to it. So while that is selected, let's click on flower. And I can go over here and I can add an effect. And so we can add a drop shadow to it for one thing. And let's just sort of move this out of the way so we can see it in comparison. And I think that the opacity is a bit heavy, so I want to drop it back a little bit. And I think in your book it has it at like 60% or something. It's up to you if you want it to be that harsh. So we'll just sort of ballpark it in that area. And then the distance is quite a bit greater. So, again, I think, for me, the heavier the distance is, the further off the page it is. So again, that is kind of your decision, how deep you'd want it to go. And you can adjust the spread. The spread, probably shouldn't be quite as big as 30%, for instance. So somewhere in the ballpark of maybe 9 or 10. Okay, and then you can adjust the size too if you want. I think I'm fine with that. And then if you wanted, like, you can keep the black color the same if you would like. That's an option. You can also play with some different colors as well, like if you wanted to kind of pick up on a more fuchsia color, for instance, you could adjust, you could play with it and see what it would do. You could make it sort of a deeper color, like this deeper fuchsia, so that the shadow isn't pure black, for instance. Like that's always an option as well, right? So you can kind of play with that so that it's kind of, got a little bit more uh, depth to it, not just in terms of like physical depth, but also color depth as well. All right, and then the other thing too that you can do while you're here is you can also add a satin effect. And if I click on satin, one of the things that that we want to do is where it says invert, you can adjust it so that you can deselect invert, or you can select it. So let's just try invert for a moment, and we're going to actually make some adjustments to this. Okay, so first thing, you want to go ahead and change the color. And again, this is kind of where I was talking about before, like you want to try to change the color so it's not black, right? You want to actually do sort of a more fuchsia color, and what you're doing is you're really picking up the intensity and increasing the vibrance that's going to be in here. So yeah, so there's that, right? You can choose sort of whatever range, and you can adjust to see, whoops, how bright you want that fuchsia color to be, and you know, just find the range that you feel is a good range for it. Okay, let's just go ahead and pick that color, I guess. And then you want to adjust the opacity. Right now the opacity is super bright, or super heavy. So we want to make it more transparent, less opaque. And you can see that the satin starts to do is it actually begins to create some interior shading, so it gives it a little bit more depth and volume. If you were to deselect it, you can see that that actually enhances that color. In addition to the opacity change, you can also adjust the distance a little bit too, so that you can uh, either make the effects more dramatic or less dramatic, and you can adjust the size as you see fit. Anyway, so that's one of the things that you can do with this to get that going. All right, and so go ahead and commit to that, and you can also save if you haven't saved recently too. Okay, now the next thing that you want to do is you'll notice that these two flowers are totally different colors. So I would go down, let's go down to flower number 2, and we're going to add an adjustment layer to change the saturation and the particular hue of this flower. Now, the thing is, you don't want to affect everything. And in one of the previous lessons, I've shown you, that with adjustment layers, it will affect everything that's beneath it. So if I, for instance, were to create an adjustment layer for where it says flower 2, it would actually also affect the beach unless I created like some sort of clipping mask for it. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that you can deal with this issue. And one is if I were to right click this, I can go ahead and I can say select pixels and it will select the pixels for me, right? And then while I have those pixels selected, what I can do is I can find my adjustments panel, and I'm going to go over here to where it says hue saturation. It looks like this little weird gradient kind of thing. I'll click on that. And then it's going to allow me to do a hue saturation layer. So I'm going to click on, if you click on colorize, for instance, you'll see that you can start to adjust the actual hue. This top part is the hue, so, or the pureness of the color. The saturation is how much color it's going to apply. Now, one of the tricks that you might notice while we're doing this is that it also started to fill in this part. Like up here it stayed green, and down here it's actually filling in with color. Okay, now if I were to take off colorize, I can start over and I can start to make some adjustments, and you'll notice that that doesn't happen. It doesn't fill in that interior part, right? So if I want to go ahead and I can find the hue that I want, so let's do it somewhere in this ballpark. Let's go somewhere in here so that we start to get that kind of pink color, right? And then if we want to adjust the saturation, we'll turn that saturation up so it's a lot more intense, not quite that intense, like somewhere in that ballpark. And then you see that the colors are very similar now. They're not so far off, and you still maintain that green inside, because what I'm not doing, if I were to say colorize, basically what I do is I completely desaturate everything and then I add color, and it applies it uniformly. If I click on colorize, it basically makes it like a sort of a monotone version of the image. But by simply leaving colorize deselected, it allows me to keep some of that other information in there that's really important. Okay, so that's something that's really critical. Now in the book, the thing that does not show you how to do right off the bat in the layers panel is it doesn't tell you to right click this and say select pixels. By my saying select pixels, what happened was that when I created that adjustment mask, it made the adjustment mask, or the adjustment layer I should say, with a mask applied to it where the only those pixels that were selected were going to get the application of that adjustment layer. And so it didn't apply to everything else in here. In the book, what it's going to tell you to do, and I think that this is kind of a problematic way to do it, is that it will tell you to go ahead and just create, without selecting these pixels first, it'll tell you to create an adjustment layer. But the problem is that that adjustment layer then muddies the color for everything else on the page. It makes everything this sort of sweet pinky bluish color, and then it tells you to go and create a clipping mask afterwards. I think that that's backwards, because you don't want it to affect everything else that's in here. You want to be able to see only the thing that you want it to actually affect, right? So that's something I think that's kind of important. Now the other thing too that you can also do, if you want to go ahead and make sure that everything has the same kind of like light and stuff like that, is I could go up here to where it says flower, and I could right click on the flower, and I could go up, let's see, where is it, find copy layer style, and then on that layer style, if I come down here where it says flower 2, I can right click and I can say paste layer style, and we can see how that actually affects it. And you start to see that it gives it like this drop shadow effect here, and it kind of makes it darker here. It actually makes it a lot more saturated on the inside because it's got that satin application. If you wanted to see what it looks like without the satin application, you could take it off, right? But you might end up liking that, but then it ends up giving us that same kind of depth that this flower up here has as well. Okay, and so one of the last things I need to do is I need to deal with this postage layer. So I'm going to turn it back on, and right now I have my move tool selected, so I need to select the postage layer so I don't move the wrong layer, and then I can actually grab it and move it around, and I think maybe like somewhere in here would make sense. Okay, so I'll kind of keep it in between these two things. And when I say these two things, what I'm talking about is the photograph and the big flower. And if you want to keep it that scale, you can. Otherwise, you could, adjust it and make it smaller with the, say, the free transform tool. If you want to do Command or Control T, and you could make it a little bit smaller holding down the Shift key. Right, it's up to you. I don't think that the book tells you to do that, but I find it a little bit distracting. So I might make mine a little bit smaller. Okay. Anyway, and so you've kind of got this thing going on, and now if you wanted to put a border around everything, um, there's several different ways that you can do this. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new layer at the very top. I think it tells you to make it somewhere else, but it needs to go on top of everything, so I'm just going to make it at the top. I'm going to click the new icon, or the new layer icon, and it creates that new layer at the top. I'll just rename it and I'll call it border. All right, and while I've got that empty border layer selected, then what I can do is I need to select everything. So you can do Control or Command A for all. You see it puts a marquee around the entire canvas, the entire artboard canvas, however you want to call it. And then what I can do is I go up to Select, all right, and then I can go to Modify Border. All right, this is one of the ways of doing it. And then I can tell it exactly how many pixels I want it to be wide. And I'm going to go ahead and let's just try, let's maybe 10 pixels for instance. You can make it smaller. And if I were to say OK, you see what it does is it starts to modify it and adds it so that it starts to create it even going on the outside, right? And then in this case, I'm going to go ahead and switch these foreground and background colors around. I'm going to click this right angle double-headed arrow so that I get white in the foreground. And then I'm going to take my paint bucket. I'm going to change it from gradient to a paint bucket. And then inside of that, I'll just click it. And then you see that I can go ahead and just fill it up all the way, right? And then you want to make sure that the edge isn't like soft and blurry. So you want to make sure that you might have to fill it up a lot. The other thing that you can do is turn the tolerance to 255, and then you don't have to worry about it being, blurry at all. All right, and it'll just fill it up. And I can deselect now, and now I've got this picture that looks like a postcard kind of. And there you go. And then if you want, you should go ahead and save this, of course. And if you want to make any other changes, you can go ahead and play around with this file and see how it goes. And I'm not going to talk about flattening files. We've already kind of discussed that several times. And I don't really believe in flattening files. I would instead export this out as a TIFF, or I'd do a file save as. Instead of flattening this file, I'd keep the original and I'd do a save a copy, get rid of the layers, and then change it from Photoshop document to a TIFF file. And then, just call it something like final or whatever, right? And then save it in your lesson folder. And then I don't ever change this really, no compression. And then now I have a flattened copy. And if you wanted to actually go and look at that for comparison, wherever it happens to be, there, I just pulled it up. Now you can see that I've got my final TIFF file and it looks exactly the same. It's great, fine, perfect. And then if I look at the difference in file sizes, you'll see that it's a much smaller file. Where is it? It's right here. It's 2.5 megabytes versus the one that I have, which is 20.8 megabytes, right? So there you have it. And that's the end of this demo for layers.